necessity is the mother of invention. We're all familiar with that, and it's all totally true. But first, you have to have the necessity. So we've been living in this wonderful moment going back to roughly 1945 when everything has been available on a global scale at global economies of scale. And that is what allowed, for example, the Germans to import all this natural gas from the Russian space and then play around with the green transition, even though they're not a windy or a sunny country. They tend to they flat out lie about their statistics. They only get about 9% of their electricity from green tech. They get more from lignite than they do from coal, more from coal from everything else combined. Oh yeah. No, they've spent a huge amount of money and they've tested the technology to the limits. And for the rest of us to benefit from that, that has been great. But it's just wildly inappropriate technology for where they live. So in order to innovate past this, now that we're actually having the crisis, and now that their Enron-style accounting methods for their carbon emissions are being laid to bear, they can start the innovation process. But we know that wind and solar cannot be part of that because it's not a windy and sunny country. And we know that natural gas can't really be a part of that because it would have to be shipped in from a different continent, and it takes 3 to 8 years for a new field to come online, much less the supporting infrastructure. So their choices are very simply, in the short term, nuclear, coal, and lignite.
What is lignite? I'm sorry, I don't know what
lignite is. A soft, wet form of brown coal that is 20% water by weight. It is the dirtiest of the fuels, and it is Germany's primary fuel source. Has been for 15 years, ever since they started the energy transition. Honestly, it's not just cobalt. There's a whole variety of materials. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but if you have a thermal power plant or a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle, basically you're lighting a match, burning something, capturing the heat, and that's what makes conventional fossil fuels work. You don't need a lot of materials aside from the fuel itself, obviously, to make that happen. But if you want to electrify, then you need a very different system for the motor and the turbine and the axles even. And at the end of the day, you also then are moving stuff. And when you are moving stuff with electricity, it requires a lot more energy. An electric water heater, as a rule, is going to require a lot more power than a natural gas-fired one. And so you have to also make the product lighter. And so you need an order of magnitude more materials than what you need for a conventional vehicle. And you need an order of magnitude different materials. You don't just need steel. You need steel and aluminum and silicon and cobalt and lithium and copper and zinc and all the rest. One of the sexy ideas of green tech is that we could finally break the geographic links of oil geopolitics that we all know and we all hate, where we have to deal with Venezuela and Iran and Iraq and Russia. It's agonizing, it's painful, it's expensive, it's dangerous. But if you want to do the green transition at scale, you then need Canada and Mexico and Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador and Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Australia and Indonesia and Malaysia and India and Pakistan and Turkey and Mongolia and Turkey. I already said Turkey, Mongolia and Kazakhstan. There we go. And China and Nigeria and Congo and South Africa and Gabon. And oh yeah, still Russia. We are discovering right now that we cannot have globally available fossil fuels at a reasonable price without the Russians. But there's no way in hell we can do the green transition without them, because they're a top 3 producer for most of the materials that we're going to need. And we're going to need 10 times what we have now.
I mean, this is what I was like reading this, and I thought to myself, anybody who is all about the green revolution just needs to read a couple of paragraphs of your book.
Yeah, if you really, really want to do the green transition with the technology we have today, then you have to love carbon and you have to love dictatorships, where the green transition at scale makes sense. Places where the solar intensity is high and reliable and the wind intensity is high and reliable. And if you are in those zones, then the technologies we have today can work. What we're seeing right now within the green community is this delightful conversation, primarily between the Californian Greens and the German Greens, because we have very similar policies in both places in terms of encouraging green tech to be put on the grid en masse. Now, the Germans have spent 3 times as much as the Californians have, but the Californians get 10 times as much electricity because the sun shines in California.
Right.
And so they're having this debate and this conversation. It's very quizzical about why in one place is it working broadly, because, it's still California, and why in the other place is it leading to complete deindustrialization? Well, and the answer is basic geography. They should have had this conversation 15 years ago. But now that we're coming up against this wall of absolute shortages in all the materials that are needed, the green community is coming to the belated conclusion that they're going to have to choose where to do this, where it will actually work. And if you put up solar panels and wind turbines in Germany as a rule, you're drastically increasing your carbon footprint. Whereas if you put them in California, you're actually doing what in theory is supposed to happen. Now, it's turning into a knife fight because the blind ideologues refuse to admit that basic geography maybe has a role in this conversation. But we're finally having that conversation. Firm up the green position within the Democratic coalition, because we're going through a political reshuffling in the United States. But the Biden administration also has two other advantages. Number one, countries like Germany have worked out a lot of the kinks in the technology, so it's much better than it was 20 years ago. So there's a low-hanging fruit argument. And then second, you've got the Great Plains in the United States. You've got the Southwest in the United States. You have some very good green tech zones. So you can apply this stuff at scale and have it actually make sense. Now, if you're putting up solar in New York, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And luckily, there's not a lot of that going on. But the Northeast, as a rule, and this is a gross over exaggeration, tends to set standards that can't be met in the United States for their fuels, and then they just import them. And since the stuff is produced somewhere else, it doesn't count against their carbon content.
Well,
it should be part of the solution. I agree. It's carbon free. There's a waste issue for disposal that has not been solved, and it doesn't look like it's going to be solved anytime soon. I would argue there the issue is time. Like if we know we have an energy crisis today and we decide we want to do a power plant build out in order to fix some of this stuff, assuming that there was not a single regulation that had to be met and we could start shoveling in the ground today, you're not going to get first power from those plants in 7 years. We just don't have that kind of time. But as the world globalized, it also industrialized and urbanized. And as people moved off the farm and into the cities to take manufacturing jobs, they went from living on 40 acres with a pig to living in a condo with a Shih Tzu. Yeah. And they went from kids being free labor to being very expensive habits. And so we went from having 7 kids to 1.2. You play that forward 75 years, and it's not that the world is running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. We're now on the edge of running out of working age adults. And without adults, you don't get the production, you don't get the consumption that is the basis of international trade. So we're in this environment now where we've had a really good run that demographically speaking was just a brief moment in time, and now we've aged out. Yeah, and in that sort of environment, demand for products drops. And you remove the Americans from providing the security environment that allows very, very slow-moving super tankers to just inch their way around the world, and everyone is going to have to trade everything differently. And countries that are a long way from their end markets have to reevaluate what is possible. And for places like Iran and Russia, not a lot makes the list. Yeah. You can call it piracy, you can call it state piracy, you can call it privateering. All of these options are now on the table, and you might not have to wait all that much longer. It was just last week that the Europeans put their price cap on Russian crude and essentially said that any Russian crude exported through its Western ports is persona non grata in the European space. All of a sudden, countries that don't like the Russians very much have a vested national interest in interrupting those flows because those flows don't go to them anymore. So if you're Latvia and you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, you could send out a Coast Guard vessel and confiscate a Russian cargo, and no one in Europe will. The Chinese will, but they're on the other side of the planet. So we're now in a position where instead of having a single oil market where everyone has a vested interest in keeping it flowing, even if it doesn't come to them, we now have a split system where parts of the world have a very clear interest in some flows, but not others. This feels a lot like the 1930s. Oh, it doesn't have much. Part of that's geography. They don't have a unified maritime space like most countries do. So, like, let's say you're Spain. You know, your fleet splits its time between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean, and there's an easy body of water with Gibraltar to connect the two. So you really only need one navy. Well, the Russian landmass has Arctic ice on one side and Europe splitting its Baltic and its Black Sea fleets, and then it's got the Pacific fleet as well. So four separate fleets that cannot reinforce. Even at the height of the Soviet period, when it was the world's second most powerful navy, it was split in four. So it was the kind of thing that, you know, the Brits by themselves could have defeated those four chunks in detail. Now you're talking about them just having a handful of functional ships in each one.